Hi guys, welcome to this new video. We are experiencing a really long heat wave with temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius over here every single day. So in today's video I want to share with you a couple of things, a couple of tips on what to do and what not to do with your plants during heat wave to help them survive those extreme temperatures. Alright, the first thing not to do with your plants during heat wave is do not repot, do not transplant your plants. Plants have quite fragile root system and that root system needs time to establish in its new pot. So already transplanting your plant puts a lot of stress on it, and then if you add the extreme heat to it, it will only make matters worse. Because during heat wave, the roots of your plants are more likely to dry out, and this can actually cause your plant to die before it has a chance to establish in its new pot. So what you can do instead, if you have a plant that's struggling because it's in too small of a container, if the plant is pot bound, there is a couple of things you can do temporarily to help it through that heat wave before you are able to repot it into a larger container. First thing to do is mulch your plants. Can be pine cones, can be pebbles, can be straw, can be moss, whatever you can find, whatever you have on hand. Add a layer of mulch because mulch will prevent the water from excessive evaporation. It will help to keep moisture in the soil. Then the second thing you can do is group plants together. When plants are grouped together, they create their own sort of microclimate. There's increased humidity and all that, so they sort of, you could say, protect one another. And then the third thing you can do to, let's say, temporarily repot your plant without actually repotting your plant is take a larger container, take your smaller pot and place that smaller pot in this larger container, and then add soil all around to isolate the smaller pot, to add a little bit more protection to prevent the soil in that smaller pot from drying out too quickly. Tip number 2 is do not leave your plants in full sun. Obviously plants need plenty of sunlight to grow, to photosynthesize, and many plants actually need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight in order to thrive. But during heat wave, when the temperatures reach above 35 degrees Celsius and they remain very hot for a while, then even the plants that like plenty of sunlight may start to show signs of stress and struggle, especially plants grown in smaller containers, young plants, plants that you recently transplanted or planted in your garden. If they are not protected from that hot blazing sunlight, they may suffer severe damage or they may even die. So how can you tell that your plant is struggling and your plant is not coping with the heat? First of all, it may start to drop its flowers or flower buds. It may start to drop its leaves. The leaves may start to turn brown and crispy, especially around the edges. So if you notice those signs, what can you do to help your plant survive through those extreme temperatures? First of all, keep your plant well watered. And then if you have some shady spot in your garden, move those more fragile, more delicate plants into that more protected shady area of your garden. Maybe you have some larger trees or larger shrubs in your garden that are a little bit more resistant, so use them sort of as a shield to protect those smaller, more delicate plants from that intense sunlight. And then use tables, chairs and benches and place those smaller pots under the table, under the chairs, to give them that extra protection from sunlight. And you could also consider putting up an umbrella, a large umbrella that will cast shadow over your garden, where you can protect those plants from that hot blazing, especially afternoon sunlight. Tip number 3, do not prune your plants. Generally speaking, pruning your plants in the middle of summer is not really a good idea. There aren't many plants that would actually require being pruned at this time of year. Especially during heat wave, you do not want to prune your plants or do anything severe with your plant, because when we prune plants, we encourage new fresh growth. So if you do it in the middle of summer during heat wave, then you are encouraging new fresh growth that will be then very susceptible to sunburn and to sun damage. So avoid pruning your plants, especially during heat wave. But something I noticed, and that's something I also spoke about in my beginner gardening mistakes video, is oftentimes beginner gardeners, when they have a plant that's struggling in the heat of summer, the plant is wilted, the plant is not doing well, it's not growing as we would expect, beginner gardeners often have that reaction, oh, I should prune my plant, I should cut it all the way back to the ground and maybe it will miraculously grow back and regenerate and come back better than it was before. And that's not really a good idea, because it can actually bring the opposite effect. Because if your plant is struggling, if something is wrong with your plant, for whatever reason it's not doing well, if you prune it, then first of all, you are putting a ton of stress on your plant, because all of a sudden the plant has to grow back, has to put all the energy it has left into growing back, into producing new fresh growth in the heat of summer, this is gonna be too much for your plant, and this can actually cause your plant to die rather than regenerate and bounce back. So do not do anything extreme with your plant, especially if it's already struggling. I know that sometimes it may be very tricky, but try to understand why the plant is struggling. Do you have some pest problem? Do you have some disease going on? Maybe it's a maintenance issue. Maybe it's really hot outside or it's really windy outside and your plant is not getting enough water and it's wilted because it's just thirsty. That's usually the case. Or maybe you are giving too much water and the plant is not able to absorb all that moisture and it's sitting in wet soil and it's causing the plant to slowly rot. So try to understand what is the base problem, because if you just prune your plant and you cut all the top growth, this isn't going to fix the problem that made that plant unhealthy. So try to understand what is going on with the plant and try to address that issue, and do not do anything extreme with your plant. Do not prune it, do not cut it all the way back to the ground. But what you can do instead, obviously if your plant has suffered a little bit of heat or sun damage, if there are some dead or damaged leaves, obviously pinch them off. You don't want the plant to be wasting energy on keeping those dead or damaged parts of the plant attached. So pinch off any dead or damaged leaves, pinch off any spent blooms or any damaged parts of the plant. You can slightly trim them, but do not prune your plant, do not do anything extreme with your plant. Alright, tip number 4 is don't forget to water your plants regularly. And I know that this is a very obvious tip, but still there's a lot of people who struggle with this. And just this past week I received several messages very similar to one another, where people tell me, my plant is wilted, my plant is struggling, it's not doing well, but I'm afraid to water it too much because I'm afraid that the roots will rot. And I totally get it, it's a very legitimate fear. But if your plant is wilted, it's 35 degrees outside and the soil is dry, you have to water your plant. But then when I say this, people tell me, yeah, but I already watered my plant like 3 days ago, 4 days ago, or it already rained a ton last week, my plant got plenty of water last week. But right now, is your plant wilted right now? Is the soil dry right now? Because if it is, you have to water your plant. Otherwise, this plant will be dead in a couple of days. It will reach a permanent wilting point and it's never gonna bounce back. So don't focus solely on when was the last time you watered your plant. Focus on right now. Check on your plants every single day. Every single day, if you notice the plant is wilted, check the soil. Stick your finger into the soil. If the soil is dry to touch, you have to water your plant. Because it doesn't matter when was the last time you watered your plant. You might have watered your plant this morning, but it was really hot during the day and the water has evaporated before your plant even had the chance to actually absorb any moisture. So in the heat of summer, you may need to water your plants even twice a day, if you have very fast draining potting mix, for example. So don't focus on when was the last time you watered, focus on, is my plant thirsty right now? Stick your finger into the soil. If it's dry, water your plants. Obviously, some plants are a little bit more drought tolerant. For example, Mediterranean plants or rock garden plants, they can take some heat, they can take some drought, but plants like annual flowers, hydrangeas, Japanese maples or caladiums or other tropical plants, they will not tolerate drought, so you have to water them regularly. But there is another situation that can happen in extreme heat. When the temperatures are really hot outside and it's too much for your plant, what can happen is the plant kind of puts itself into sort of a dormant state. It kind of shuts off. So what happens is the plant is wilted, you water it, but the plant is not absorbing any moisture. So in a day or two, you see your plant is still wilted, you check the soil is still moist. It means that the plant is in sort of a dormant state, it's not actually absorbing any moisture. It's a very tricky situation because there isn't much you can really do, because if the plant is not absorbing any moisture, you can't add more water because then you are gonna drown your plant. So you just have to wait through it, and you have to kind of be ready that you might lose the whole plant or at least some parts of the plant. It happened with my clematis, I'm gonna show you just in a second. Parts of the plant started to die back because it was just too intense for the plant. Even though it was well watered, even though it's in partial shade, it was still too much because I pruned my plant this spring, so it has a lot of fresh new growth, and as I said before, that new fresh growth is always more susceptible to any extremes of temperature. So I'm gonna show you parts of my clematis have died back, but that's just what happens sometimes. Even if you try your best, even if you do everything right, sometimes, we can't control nature, and sometimes, well, damage happens, and sometimes you can't save your plant even if you try really hard. Tip number 5 is do not wet your plant's leaves. I know it may sound tempting to give your plant a refreshing shower, but water droplets on the leaves will act as magnifying glass, intensifying the heat, and then humidity around the leaves and dry soil around the roots can promote powdery mildew. So water your plants well, but direct the water onto the roots not on the leaves. And tip number 6 is do not fertilize your plants, because similarly to pruning, fertilizing encourages new fresh growth. And as we said already before, it's not a good idea to promote that new fresh growth, especially during a heat wave, because then that new fresh growth will be very susceptible to sun damage. But what I do instead in my garden, and I spoke a ton about this product already in many of my videos, this is Power Roots. This is potassium and vitamins based additive that has multiple uses. First of all, it encourages healthy root development. It helps with the transplant shock, but because it contains potassium, it also strengthens the plant's tissues and it makes the plants more resistant. So this is something that will be great to use if you struggle with any pest or disease, because it makes plants more resistant. I also use it in autumn to prepare my plants for winter, and that's something that I also use in the heat of summer to help my plants cope with the heat and make them more resistant. So I add a little bit of that with my water. This isn't going to encourage new healthy growth because it doesn't contain nitrogen. It contains potassium and vitamins, so it's only going to make plant more resistant without actually promoting new fresh growth. Okay, I hope that you found some helpful tips in today's video. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see each other in the next video.